She smashed my brand new car, so I had hers towed within the hour. It had been years since I had allowed myself something new, something that was just for me. Most of my life had been calculated around bills, responsibilities, and quiet sacrifices nobody else seemed to notice. My shoes had always lasted a season longer than they should have. My shirts were pressed, but their collars told the story of too many years spent in the office. Even my old Toyota, though dependable, carried the weary hum of an overworked mule. One I had driven through rainstorms, late-night shifts, and across state lines when family obligations demanded it. But this was different. That morning, the sun caught the metallic sheen of my brand-new Lexus like it was born to be there, sitting on my cracked driveway, almost mocking the old stains of motor oil and fallen leaves. Midnight blue, a shade that shifted between black and deep ocean depending on the light, it wasn't just a car. It was proof. Proof that years of missed vacations, canceled dinners, and overtime hours hadn't been for nothing. The key fob felt weighty in my hand as I stood admiring it. I pressed the unlock button just for the satisfaction of hearing that subtle chirp. The leather seat still carried that intoxicating scent, new, clean, unspoiled. When I sank into the driver's side for the first time, I felt the seat mold around me, adjusting automatically. For once, the world felt aligned. It wasn't about showing off. Not really. It was about reclaiming something that had been slowly taken from me by routine, responsibility, and, if I was being honest, resignation. The Lexus was my shiny new beginning. But beginnings are rarely allowed to stay shiny in my neighborhood. The subdivision was manicured to the point of suffocation. Identical lawns, identical shutters, mailboxes lined up like obedient soldiers. Everything appeared picture-perfect on the surface, but anyone who lived here long enough knew it was a kingdom with one ruler: Karen. Karen was the HOA president, self-appointed monarch of our cul-de-sac. Blonde bob that never shifted out of place, sunglasses that seemed surgically attached to her face, and a clipboard she carried like a scepter. She had ruled the community board for nearly a decade, surviving coups from would-be challengers the way a dictator crushes uprisings. She thrived on order, fines, and petty power. And she noticed everything. So, when my Lexus appeared in the driveway that morning, gleaming like an intruder against the cookie-cutter monotony of beige minivans and weathered sedans, I might as well have painted a target on it. I first spotted her through the blinds, her head turning sharply as she walked her golden retriever. She stopped, squinted, and tilted her head the way a bird sizes up a threat. I knew that look. Everyone in the neighborhood did. The last time she'd worn it, Mr. Alvarez down the street had dared to plant rose bushes that weren't on the HOA's approved vegetation list. 2 weeks later, he was forced to rip them out after Karen distributed passive-aggressive flyers about unsanctioned flora endangering community aesthetics. The time before that, she'd had a middle-aged widow written up for leaving her garbage can visible an extra 15 minutes past collection day. Karen had no tolerance for deviation, and my Lexus was deviation in metallic paint. Still, I didn't care. For once, I wasn't going to hide. I had earned this. That evening, when I pulled into the driveway after work, there it was, a note folded neatly under my wiper blade. Notice of noncompliance. All vehicles parked in visible driveways must conform to HOA standards regarding neighborhood harmony. Midnight blue Lexus is an unapproved color. Consider parking in the garage. I almost laughed. Unapproved color. That wasn't a rule. I had memorized the rulebook years ago when she first tried to fine me for putting up solar lights along the walkway. Nothing in there mentioned car colors. I tore the paper in half, then in half again. But as the pieces fluttered to the ground, I realized something. This wasn't about the car. It was about me. Karen didn't like when anyone broke from her script, when anyone reminded her that power only works if people bend to it. And now, with my Lexus gleaming in the driveway, She saw me as an act of rebellion. The next day, the whispers started. Mrs. Jennings, the elderly neighbor 2 doors down, paused while watering her azaleas. "That's quite a car you've got there," she said. Her voice was kind, but there was hesitation in her eyes, as if complimenting me was an act of betrayal against Corinne. Later, as I unloaded groceries, I caught sight of 2 board members, Rick and Janice, standing at the end of the cul-de-sac. They weren't talking loudly enough for me to hear, but their glances said enough. The Lexus wasn't just a car anymore. It was a spark, and sparks in HOA territory often lit fires. That night I sat in the driver's seat again, engine humming softly. I ran my hands along the wheel, whispering to myself, "Let her come, let her try." Because this time, I wasn't just a resident trying to keep the peace. This time, I had something worth fighting for. And deep down I knew, this was only the beginning. The first official warning didn't arrive in an envelope. It came in the form of Corinne herself. I should have expected it. She couldn't resist confrontation, not when something gleamed brighter than her authority. It was at the monthly HOA meeting, a ritualistic gathering in the clubhouse that always smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. The folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing the head table, where Corinne presided like a judge at trial. A projector screen flickered in the corner, usually reserved for reviewing community updates, though more often it was used to showcase photographs of violations around the neighborhood. Trash cans left out too long, shutters painted a shade too dark, mailboxes with chipped paint. I had skipped these meetings for years, letting the petty politics play out without me. But after the Lexus, I knew better. I knew I had to show my face, if only to see what battlefield I'd stepped onto. Corinne's eyes found me the moment I walked in. Her gaze dropped to the car key fob in my hand, dangling almost unconsciously from my fingers. That was all it took. A flicker of disdain passed across her lips before she tightened them into a smile, sharp, controlled, a predator's grin. The meeting began with the usual monotony. Rick, the treasurer, droned on about community funds and how much was being allocated for landscaping. Janice raised a concern about potholes forming near the playground. A few parents argued over whether the pool should extend its hours during summer. And then Corinne cleared her throat. "As we move into our final agenda item," she said, her voice laced with authority, "I want to discuss the matter of visual standards." Her phrasing was deliberate. She didn't say cars or driveways. She said visual standards, as if my Lexus had suddenly transformed into a blight, a neon sign advertising rebellion. She gestured toward me, openly theatrically. "Some of us," she continued, "have chosen to introduce vehicles into our neighborhood that, while impressive in their own way, may not align with the aesthetic harmony we've worked so hard to maintain." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people shifted uncomfortably, others stared at the floor. No one dared to look at me. I forced a laugh, though my throat felt dry. "It's just a car, Corinne." Corinne tilted her head, the way she always did when someone challenged her. "Too flashy for this neighborhood," she said, her words sharpened like knives. "Reflects poorly on our standards." Her tone was casual, but her eyes told a different story. This wasn't an opinion. It was a warning. I tried to brush it off. "Last I checked, the handbook doesn't have rules on what people can drive." "Not explicitly," she conceded, "but the board reserves the right to enforce guidelines that protect our community reputation." There it was. She wasn't just opinionated, she was territorial, and she had just laid the groundwork to make me the next example. The rest of the meeting dragged on, but I couldn't focus. The knot in my stomach tightened with every word Corinne spoke. She had already declared war, even if she hadn't put it in writing yet. When the meeting ended, neighbors shuffled out quickly, avoiding eye contact. Only Mrs. Jennings lingered near me. She leaned in and whispered, "Be careful. Once she sets her sights on you, she doesn't let go. That night, I replayed her words in my head. I wanted to believe Karen was just blustering, flexing her usual control. But then the warning signs began multiplying. The first was small, a second notice of noncompliance, this time stamped with the HOA seal. It demanded that I consider storing the Lexus in my garage to avoid unnecessary attention. The second was pettier. My mailbox flag went missing. A trivial act of vandalism, maybe, but no one else in the neighborhood had been targeted. Then came the third, and it was harder to dismiss. One Saturday morning, I found a chalk line drawn crudely across my driveway, right where the Lexus usually sat. At first I thought it was kids playing, but the shape was too deliberate, too precise. It boxed in the car's usual spot, almost like a boundary, a cage. I stared at it for a long time, my jaw tight, my fists clenched. That was when I realized Karen wasn't just playing games anymore. She was sending messages. And with every warning, the war I hadn't wanted was becoming inevitable. The meeting aftermath. I should have ignored her, but I couldn't. Something about the way Karen had singled me out lingered long after the clubhouse lights went dark. At work the following Monday, I caught myself staring at spreadsheets, the numbers blurring. My mind kept flashing back to her words, reflects poorly on our standards. It wasn't just about the car. Karen was rewriting the rules as she went, reshaping the neighborhood into her personal fiefdom, and she had just decided my Lexus didn't belong. On my lunch break, I pulled up the HOA bylaws on my phone, scrolling line by line. Nowhere did it say anything about vehicles needing to match aesthetic harmony. There were rules about fence height, lawn ornament limits, even restrictions on holiday decorations, but not cars. I highlighted the passages, took screenshots, even printed copies to keep in my glove compartment. If Karen wanted to drag me into battle, I was arming myself. But no matter how much evidence I gathered, I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. This wasn't about logic. It was about control. And Karen never lost control. Neighbors divided. The Lexus began drawing more attention than I anticipated. Some neighbors approached me with quiet admiration. "Beautiful car," whispered a man I barely knew as we crossed paths by the mailbox. His tone carried envy, but also fear, as though even complimenting me might be reported back to Karen. Others avoided me altogether, their conversations cutting off when I approached. It was as if I had become radioactive, a living reminder that standing out had consequences. But the worst part wasn't the silence. It was the way Karen's influence slithered into every corner. At the next HOA bulletin board update, I noticed a new flyer pinned neatly to the cork. Reminder: all residents are expected to respect the visual and financial harmony of our community. Excessive displays of wealth or ostentation undermine the neighborhood spirit. No names, no specifics, but everyone knew who it was aimed at. And for the first time I felt it: isolation, the subtle, suffocating kind. The breaking point. One night, returning from work, I found Karen standing in my driveway. She circled the Lexus slowly, her manicured nails tapping against her clipboard. The street lamp cast her shadow long and thin, like a vulture hovering over prey. "What are you doing on my property?" I asked, stepping out of the car. "Just ensuring everything is up to code," she replied, her voice syrupy sweet. I clenched my jaw. "There's no code against owning a car." "Not yet," she said, her smile widening. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. And in that moment, I knew two things. Karen wouldn't stop, and if I wanted to protect what I had earned, neither could I. The warning signs had turned into battle lines, and the war for my driveway had just begun. The night before it happened, the air was already thick with tension. Karen had cornered me at the end of the HOA meeting, her heels clicking sharply on the tiled floor as she approached. The room had mostly cleared out, but a few neighbors lingered, shuffling papers or pretending to be busy so they wouldn't have to walk past us. She didn't waste time. "You're still parking that spectacle in your driveway," she hissed, lowering her sunglasses onto her nose even though the room was fluorescent lit. "You're in violation." I folded my arms. "There is no violation, Corinne. I've read the bylaws twice." Her lips curled upward in a smile that wasn't really a smile at all. "Don't confuse absence of wording with permission. The board interprets, and she tapped her clipboard like it was a gavel, "am the board." I should have walked away, but something in me snapped. Months of biting my tongue, of watching her terrorize everyone else in the neighborhood, of refusing to stand tall, it all boiled over. "For years, you've bullied people with your fake rules and your fake authority," I shot back, loud enough for the stragglers to hear. "This isn't your neighborhood. You don't own us." A hush fell over the room. Rick froze with his papers mid-shuffle. Janice's eyes darted nervously between us. Even Mrs. Jennings, who always avoided confrontation, paused at the door. Corinne leaned in closer, her perfume sharp, her voice dripping with venom. "You'll regret speaking to me that way," she said softly. "People who think they can outshine me always regret it." She turned sharply on her heel and left, her shadow stretching long against the wall. I told myself it was just bluster, just another one of her intimidation tactics, but the knot in my stomach told me otherwise. The next morning I stepped outside with my coffee, ready to face another day. The air was crisp, dew still clinging to the grass. Birds chirped in the distance. For a moment everything seemed normal. And then I froze. The Lexus stood, or rather, what was left of it, like a broken carcass in the driveway. Both front windows were smashed, jagged glass glittering on the pavement like shards of ice. The side mirrors dangled by their wires, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Deep, angry scratches ran down both doors, gouges so deliberate they looked carved, not accidental. The hood bore a dent, as though someone had slammed down on it with all their strength. At the curb, just a few feet away, lay the weapon, a baseball bat. Its wood splintered near the end, flecks of blue paint, my Lexus's paint streaked along its surface. My coffee slipped from my hand, shattering on the concrete. For a long moment I couldn't move. My chest tightened, my breathing shallow, like the air itself had turned toxic. And then I felt it, the heat, the rage. It surged through me so fast my hands trembled. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run to Corinne's house and slam on her perfect white door until the hinges rattled. But then, as if summoned, she appeared. Across the street, standing on her pristine lawn, arms folded, was Corinne. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The smirk on her face said everything. Neighbors began to gather. One by one, curtains shifted, doors opened, feet shuffled across driveways. A small crowd formed as if destruction was entertainment. "Good Lord," someone muttered. "Such a shame," another whispered. But nobody came forward. Nobody offered help. They just stared, their silence louder than any words. Mrs. Jennings stood at the edge of her lawn, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. She wanted to say something. I could see it, but she didn't. Corinne's presence kept her frozen. It was then I understood the power Corinne held. It wasn't in her clipboard or her bylaws. It was in the fear she cultivated. The fear that made good people stay silent. And in their silence I stood alone. I knelt beside the Lexus, running my fingers across the scratches. Each line burned like an insult carved into my skin. My reflection in the shattered glass looked warped, distorted, like a man I didn't recognize. This car had been more than just metal and paint. It had been a symbol of my sacrifices, my proof that I was finally allowed to want something for myself. And now it was ruined, violated. The police report was a formality. The officer arrived, took notes, clicked a few photos, and promised they'd look into it. But when I asked if Corinne would be questioned, he only shrugged. No witnesses, no cameras, no proof, he said. Without evidence, it's just suspicion. Suspicion. As if the bat lying there, as if Corinne's smug smirk across the street wasn't enough. Corinne knew. She knew she could get away with it. And worse, she knew I knew it too. That night I sat on my porch long after the sun had set, staring at the mangled Lexus under the dull glow of the street lamp. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Corinne's smirk. Every time I tried to breathe, I felt the weight of her control pressing down on me. I could fix the car. I could replace the windows, repaint the doors, buff out the scratches, but I couldn't fix what had been taken from me. The sense of safety. The belief that hard work meant something. She hadn't just shattered my car. She had shattered the illusion that playing by the rules could protect me. And as I sat there in the darkness, the anger hardened into something else, something sharper. Resolve. Corinne thought she had won. She thought her intimidation had broken me, but she was wrong. She had just lit the fuse. And I wasn't going to wait for her to strike again. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, every creak of the house sounding like a threat. My mind kept replaying the sound of glass shattering, even though I hadn't heard it when it happened. Phantom noises filled the silence. The image of Corinne's smirk lingered behind my eyelids like a brand I couldn't blink away. But as restless hours passed, another thought broke through the fog of anger. The camera. It was almost laughable how long it took me to remember. Months earlier, after a break-in scare 2 streets over, I had installed a discreet security system, motion-activated, infrared, high-resolution. Corinne herself had mocked me for it. Paranoid much, she had said with a chuckle at one of the board meetings. Now that paranoia was my salvation. I climbed out of bed, padded barefoot down the hall, and booted up the monitor in my small office. The screen flickered to life, bathing the room in blue light. My heart hammered against my ribs as I clicked through the menu. Motion events, midnight, driveway. I hovered over the file, my cursor trembling. For a moment, I almost didn't want to see. There was a part of me that feared the footage would show nothing, that maybe I'd wake up from this nightmare and realize the destruction was some cruel coincidence. But denial was a coward's luxury. I pressed play. The footage came alive. At first, only the stillness of my driveway. The Lexus gleamed faintly under the street lamp, innocent, unaware of the violence to come. The timestamp blinked, 12:02 a.m. Then movement. Corinne appeared, storming across my yard in slippers and a robe, her hair unkempt, her face twisted with something feral. In her hands, clutched tightly, was the bat. She didn't hesitate. She didn't sneak or glance around. No, she marched straight to my car, raised the bat high, and swung with the full force of someone who wanted not just to damage, but to destroy. Glass exploded in a spray of fragments. She swung again and again, the camera capturing every brutal arc of the bat. Her slippers slipped on the pavement, but she kept going, gritting her teeth, her mouth open in a snarl. The mirrors went next, one clean strike, then another, until they dangled by their wires like broken limbs. Then she dragged the bat along the doors, slow and deliberate, carving deep scars into the paint. And then, as if it wasn't enough, she slammed the bat onto the hood, denting it with a dull, hollow thud. She didn't cover her face. She didn't wear gloves. She didn't even try to hide. She wanted me to see. When she finished, she tossed the bat toward the curb, dusted off her hands, and walked back across my lawn. She glanced once toward the camera, straight into the lens, straight into me. And she smiled. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the desk so tightly my knuckles whitened. My chest rose and fell in uneven bursts. I had thought seeing it would bring me peace, that vindication would dull the anger. But it didn't. If anything, it made it worse. Because now I knew. Now I had undeniable proof, and with that proof came responsibility. I rewound the footage, watched it again, And again. Each time my fury deepened. Each time Karen's smug grin seared itself deeper into my mind. This wasn't random vandalism. This was a message. And now I had the reply. The next morning, I burned the video to a flash drive, my fingers shaking as I ejected it from the port. The small piece of plastic felt heavier than gold in my pocket. It wasn't just evidence. It was a weapon. I considered my options. Police first, of course, but would they act differently now? I had called before and they had shrugged me off. Without evidence, they said. Well, here it was, crystal clear. But a nagging thought whispered in the back of my mind. Karen always slithered out of consequences. She had friends on the board, whispers of friends in local offices. What if even this wasn't enough? The idea chilled me. Still, I had to try. At the station, I handed the flash drive to the officer on duty. He plugged it in, and we watched together as Karen unleashed her midnight fury. Jesus, he muttered under his breath. She didn't even try to hide it. So you'll charge her? I asked, leaning forward. He hesitated, scratching his jaw. Looks pretty damning. We'll take it to the DA, but he trailed off. But what? She's influential, isn't she? HOA president. My jaw clenched. So what? This is vandalism, criminal damage. He sighed. Yeah, it should be open and shut. Just don't expect her to go down quietly. People like her, they fight, they twist, they stall. His words were meant as caution, but they only fanned the fire inside me. News spread faster than I expected. By evening, whispers rippled through the cul-de-sac. Neighbors who once avoided me now stole glances, curious, nervous. Some offered hushed sympathy. About time someone caught her. One man muttered while collecting his mail. But most stayed quiet. Fear still bound their tongues. And then there was Karen. That evening she strolled down the street, not a trace of shame in her step. She carried her clipboard as always, stopping to chat with a neighbor, laughing as if she hadn't just been caught on camera committing a crime. When her eyes met mine across the street, she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Instead, she raised her hand and waved. Mocking, taunting. She knew I had the footage, and she didn't care. That night I sat on my porch, the flash drive heavy in my pocket, and realized the truth. Evidence was power, but power didn't guarantee justice. Karen wouldn't go down with one swing. She would fight, smear, manipulate. She would twist the narrative until I was the villain. And if the system couldn't stop her, then I would have to. For the first time I understood. This wasn't about cars or rules anymore. It was war. And now I had my first weapon. That became my mantra over the days I sat with the footage on repeat, watching Karen's bat carve a message across the Lexus. The footage had given me clarity. It had also given me patience. I could have marched to her porch and smashed her rose pots. I could have left anonymous notes or keyed her Mercedes in the night. But petty destruction would only keep us on the same savage level, and she wanted me to be savage. She wanted me to be a spectacle she could narrate at board meetings and neighborhood barbecues. So I chose a different weapon, the rule book. I reread the HOA covenants until the letters blurred. There were clauses tucked into clauses, pages of tone-policed language that favored community harmony and guest amenity preservation. Most residents never bothered beyond the basics about lawn heights and mailbox colors. I devoured the sections no one else read: guest parking allocation, unauthorized long-term use of common lots, towing authorization procedures. If Karen understood how to twist rules to fine Mrs. Alvarez for a garden gnome, then I could use the same rules against her. Lawyering with a lawyer's precision wasn't necessary. I only needed to know the exact sentence that made her car a legitimate target. Karen had made a habit of using the guest lot. Late dinners with friends, the weekly bridge club, lunches at the cafe, whatever the excuse, her Mercedes was often tucked into that broad communal space reserved for visitors. Residents circulated memos about overuse. but they were ignored by most. Karen paid her fines when they were levied. Fines were part of the choreography of power. This time, I intended to change the choreography. First, I called the property manager. He was a placid man named Omar who answered with the civil distance of someone accustomed to petty fights. I explained, measured, calm, that Karen's Mercedes had been parked in the guest lot overnight, repeatedly, and that the covenants allowed for towing of vehicles that occupied guest parking for more than 24 hours without authorization. He hummed, requested documentation, asked if I'd like to file an official complaint. Of course I wanted to. I attached timestamps from my camera showing Karen's car there at midnight, early morning, and during the day. I included a short note. Ms. Harper, Mercedes S-Class, license plate XXX, pattern of unauthorized use. I folded the wording tight and formal, the way legal memos should be folded. Omar asked me if I wanted him to authorize towing. That was a pleasant surprise. It meant the property manager was willing to follow procedure if the complaint was properly laid out. I can, he said, but we'll need the board to ratify it at the next emergency session. I don't want a lawsuit. Their lawyers are quick. He suggested a softer approach. Issue a final notice, levy a fine, be stern. I thanked him and let him think it would be his choice. In truth, I had already anticipated his line and was ready for the next move. If the board stalled, I could escalate. If Omar was nervous, I could show him the footage, make the damage to my Lexus tangible. Evidence had taken the policeman off the fence earlier. Now it could push Omar into motion. Next, I did something small and public. I placed an official-looking complaint on the HOA online portal, copying all board members. The complaint was clinical dates, times, excerpts from the bylaws, screenshots of the car in the guest lot. I did not use inflammatory language. I didn't call Karen a vandal. I simply documented instances of unauthorized parking and requested enforcement. I made sure my tone could stand up in a courtroom if it needed to. The reaction was immediate. Karen's name flared up in message threads. Some members whispered that this was petty. Others argued that rules were rules. As I watched the notifications roll in, I kept my face unreadable, an empty mask. That night, the board scheduled an emergency meeting for the next afternoon. Karen, predictably, RSVP'd with a terse, "Will be there." The plan required a few pieces to fall perfectly into place. It needed procedure, so nobody could claim I'd acted unlawfully, public exposure, so the crowd would see, so it wouldn't be just me saying Karen was wrong. And timing, so Karen would be in the meeting when the tow happened. Humiliated, exposed, surrounded by the very neighbors she lorded over. I called the towing company I used years ago when my old Toyota had died in the mall parking lot. The owner, Marco, still remembered me. He was an unhurried man with a coal-black beard and an easy laugh. I asked him how towing for HOAs worked. He explained the steps: HOA or property manager authorization, a conspicuously posted notice on the offending car, a window period of 48 hours to allow for retrieval, and if the owner didn't remove the vehicle, we towed. He warned me about legal pushback, owners who called their lawyers and tried to grab their cars back before they hit the truck's lift. I told Marco I had authorization coming, and I asked him to keep a truck on standby, unmarked, nondescript, because I wanted discretion until the right moment. "You sure you want to play with fire?" he asked. "This kind of pull could get messy." I heard concern, but also that spark of appetite in his voice. He liked the theater of dramatic tows as much as anyone. That evening, I drafted the notice that had to be physically attached to the Mercedes, a polite but final demand: unauthorized use of guest parking. Vehicle is subject to tow under HOA Code Section 7(4). Please remove within 48 hours. I printed it on bold letterhead, "The portal accepted," and folded it into my pocket like an accusation. On the day of the emergency meeting, the clubhouse was a pressure cooker. Karen appeared immaculately coiffed, not a hair out of place. She moved through the room like someone performing ritual. Hellos were diplomatic nods. Her smile, when she gave it, felt like a blade balanced on the edge of a table. She was quicker in person than on video, her voice lubricated by years of rehearsed authority. Board members arranged themselves like loyal courtiers. Rick sat stiffly at the table. Janice shuffled papers as if searching for some invisible condemnation. Omar opened the session with procedural primness, and then, without theatrics, I requested a suspension of normal order to address a compliance matter. I presented my complaint to the board, dates, timestamps, supporting clauses. I didn't show the footage. That was an escalation I kept for later. Instead, I anchored my case in the bylaws and the portal logs that showed the Mercedes pattern. I told the room calmly that enforcement was not personal, it was contractual. The rules existed to protect communal use, not to be selectively applied. Corinne's reaction was immediate. She spoke loud, indignant. "This is preposterous," she said. "We use guest parking because the garages are full. The Mercedes is not mine. Sometimes it's my sister's when she visits." She offered the kind of plausible deniability she used when levying fines, plausible and practiced. "Then show proof," I said quietly, and the room exhaled. There was a brittle edge to my voice that even Rick noticed. He cleared his throat and peered down at the paperwork. A few neighbors, standing in the back, leaned forward. Omar, after a brief closed-door consultation, announced the only choice he felt safe making. A notice would be affixed to the Mercedes. The statute would be invoked, 48 hours. If the vehicle remained, he would authorize the tow. He did not volunteer his reasons beyond enforcement of the covenant. Corinne's face flashed through micro-expressions, apprehension, then contempt. She knew rules. She also knew how to gaslight them. I left the clubhouse with my pulse steady and the small, bright thrill of a plan set into motion. The notice was placed mid-afternoon on Corinne's windshield, visible and businesslike. I watched from my porch, pretending to water a plant while Alex from 2 doors down mowed his lawn. The note sat like a verdict. The neighborhood held its breath. For the next 24 hours, people whispered in clipped tones. Would Corinne remove the car, or would she flaunt the order and push for a showdown? Corinne posted a terse message on the HOA board accusing me of harassment, calling the complaint malicious and me petty. She wrote that the parking rules were unclear and that enforcement was inconsistent. Someone had already expected this. Corinne's backup play was to challenge integrity and to create enough procedural confusion to delay action. But the clock kept moving. 48 hours passed. Corinne was absent from her property more than usual. She had long games, I was told. The Mercedes stayed. Neighbors who had once bowed in her presence now watched with a curious, unmasked look. There was a satisfaction in their faces I hadn't seen before. The unease I'd felt in earlier chapters, the way they folded in on themselves when Corinne broomed through their lives, was shifting toward something else, a dawning permission to see her as flawed. At 10:30 on the third morning, Marco's truck arrived. It was a low-key, workmanlike beast. No siren, no blaring sign, just the practical grumble of machinery. 2 men moved with efficient silence and placed cones around the Mercedes. They photographed its plates, logged its condition, and hooked the winch. It took minutes for the crowd to gather. It took seconds for phones to be raised. Corinne appeared at her front door in slippers and a cardigan, the morning's hair askew, the color gone from her cheeks. She watched from the stoop, hands pressed together like a supplicant as her Mercedes was winched up and lifted. For the first time in my memory, she seemed uncertain. No furious speeches, no clipped orders. Her mouth trembled, and she glared at me across the street, furious and small at once. "You can't do this," she shrieked when one of the tow men paused to explain the documentation. She barked that she had authorization to park, that the tow was illegal, that she'd see us in court. Marco tightened his grip on the controls. "Your vehicle was in violation of HOA Code Section 7(4), he said calmly. "You were given notice and the stipulated period passed. We're authorized by the property manager." Corinne's shriek broke into a sob of furious disbelief. Neighbors watched. A dozen faces stared. Some were surprised, Others flicked their eyes away, remembering the fines and verdicts she'd imposed on them. There was, oddly, a ripple of something like relief. As the Merceds disappeared down the street, the crowd dissolved into murmurs. I felt the twitch of triumph rise, then steadied it. This was not a finale. It was a statement. Back at home that evening, I sat on the steps of my porch and felt the weight of what had been done. I had weaponized rules she used as a cudgel. I had weaponized patience, paperwork, and the thin dignity of procedure. But underneath the small victory, an awareness pulsed. Karen would not vanish. She would retaliate. She had the unapologetic penchant for escalation I had seen on the footage. Tonight's tow was a necessary humiliation. Tomorrow might be something far worse. Still, there was a sweet clarity as I exhaled. For once, the neighborhood had seen her unadorned, heard the thinness in her arguments, watched the falter in her posture. For once, power had been balanced. Revenge had been served cold, legal and visible. And somewhere in the dark, as I closed the door and turned the lock, I began making lists again. Next steps, contingencies, the kinds of moves that turn a skirmish into a campaign. The tow had been the first move in a long game. Karen had been rattled but not broken. That was fine. So long as she kept showing herself, I could keep playing the rules against her, and more dangerously, teach the neighborhood that rules could be used to protect them, not just to punish. Tonight, the Lexus sat silent in the garage while I pored over the bylaws. The marching orders for the next phase were already forming in the margins of my notes. The morning air felt thin, like the breath you hold before speaking a truth aloud. The street was quieter than usual. No mower roars, no dog walk chatter, only the distant hum of a truck idling somewhere down the block. I stood at my kitchen window with a mug of coffee gone cold, watching a small drama arrange itself across the street. Exactly 1 hour after I first discovered the damage to the Lexus, the tow truck arrived. It was a practical-looking rig, utilitarian and unsentimental, the kind of vehicle that made final decisions without loud theatrics. Marco's driver eased the truck into position, the hydraulic arm whining softly as it unfolded like a mechanical armoring ritual. Cones were placed, photos were taken, and the men moved with the businesslike efficiency of men who did this 100 times and wanted it to be done cleanly. Even from my porch, I could hear the metallic clink of chains and the faint beep of a backup sensor. The sound threaded through the neighborhood, somehow both ordinary and monumental. People appeared like flowers opening, heads peeking from behind curtains, slippers shuffling onto porches, phones rising to record. Karen was unmistakable when she finally came out. She barreled from her front door in a bathrobe tied too tight, hair piled in a scatter of desperation on her head and slippers slapping against the pavement. Her face was raw with outrage, crimson flushing her neck and cheeks. "That's my car," she screamed, voice cracking on the corner of each syllable. Give that back. You can't, this is illegal." She stomped toward the truck, arms flailing, the robe gaping with each exaggerated gesture. For a moment she looked less like the controlled HOA president and more like someone unmasked, a costume ripped away to reveal the flailing person underneath. I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, and watched. I could feel the neighborhood watching me back, the tilt of heads, the glances that once would have bent toward her favor. I could see lines of curiosity, schadenfreude, and a cautious sense of relief forming on faces I'd known for years. When Karen reached the truck, she leaned over the tailgate and began to shout at the men, brandishing her phone like a talisman. "You have no right," she cried. "This is harassment. I'll sue. Who authorized this? This is a crime." Marco's apprentice, a young man with tired eyes, set the winch into motion without breaking his calm. "Sir, ma'am, vehicle was in unauthorized guest parking after notice," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We followed procedure. Property manager approved the tow." "Property manager," Karen scoffed, her voice rising to an operatic pitch. "That manager is a fool. He has no authority to—" She stopped as if someone had jabbed her with a pin. A woman across the street had her phone in hand. She wasn't filming the spectacle so much as scanning the tow authorization document pinned to the truck's clipboard. A neighbor stepped forward and read aloud, voice crisp, "Authorization granted pursuant to HOA Code Section 7, 4, unauthorized prolonged guest parking." The sentence landed like a reckoning. For an instant, the rawness in Corinne's face flickered between rage and a flash of doubt. It was tiny and human, an involuntary gap in her armor. Then she swallowed and returned to her practiced fury. "This is a setup," she spat. "He's conspiring against me. You'll regret this." I lowered my mug and offered a measured smile, a polite, almost casual expression that I kept calibrated so it wouldn't explode into glee. "Not a setup," I called across the street, letting the words carry. "HOA rules, remember." Her eyes narrowed. She jabbed a finger toward me, a theatrical gesture meant to shame. "You of all people are petty and vindictive," she shouted. "You've got no proof, you're a liar." I let her ramble. The truck's winch hummed and the Mercedes began to lift, the rear wheels scraping the pavement, the car rising like an altar being taken away. Corinne's protests dissolved into splutters, the sentences broken and pointless. Around us, a crowd had formed. Neighbors clustered 3 deep on the lawn, a ring of silent jury faces. As the Mercedes cleared the curb, someone on the other side of the street who had often accepted Corinne's rules without question spoke up in a voice that sounded small and steady. She said something like, "This happened to Mr. Alvarez last year. He paid the fine and never got an apology." The speaker's admission was a pebble dropping into still water. Ripples moved outward. Heads turned. Conversations, low at first, began to swell. Corinne's fury sharpened into a practiced misdirection. "This is victim performance," she cried. "He's fabricating grievances to smear me. He wants to take my home from me." Her words were garbage, overwrought, melodramatic, but they had been used before. Inflate the narrative, force sympathy, create a fog. But this was different. The fog was thinning. The tape on the truck's clipboard shook faintly as Marco secured the Mercedes. The formal document was a weight that couldn't be wrung out by theatrics. When the truck pulled away, the clack of its tires grew smaller until it was gone. The street felt suddenly empty, not because noise had stopped, but because an imbalance had shifted. A local sovereign had been publicly humbled. People returned to their routines, but their faces carried a new permission. Mrs. Jennings waved at me as if she'd just cleared a debt. "Good for you," she whispered, voice thick. A teenager who had previously flinched at Corinne's glare gave me a thumbs up from across the lawn, cheeky and fierce. Even Janice, who usually sat silent at meetings, made an awkward host of small talk and then told me, quietly, "Some of us are tired." The hour was a small revolution, slow and polite, but its heat lingered. Inside, I felt a calculus shift. For months, I had been a man in reaction, hurt, then enraged, then vindictive. Watching Corinne shriek at the loss of her vehicle, I sensed that the campaign I'd started was picking up velocity. The tow had been legal, cold, and procedural. That was its genius. It had cut through the emotional fog with documentation and process. It had, in public, exposed her vulnerability. But victory was a narrow thing. I'd achieved a humiliating procedural win, but there were consequences curling like smoke on a mirror. Corinne would not accept this as an endpoint. She would strategize, escalate, and deploy allies. She could magnify the episode into martyrdom, rallying the fearful to her side and painting me as a harasser who weaponized bylaws to target a vulnerable woman. Worse, she could threaten legal action, at which point petty homeowners must either spend money in litigation or be cowed by the process itself. I didn't want to be the initiator of more harm to the neighborhood. I wanted balance. I wanted accountability. But I also realized the line between justice and escalation is paper-thin and easily torn. That evening the house hummed with messages. My inbox filled with direct notes, some supportive, some cautionary, some furious that the community would allow such public shamming. Corinne's allies fired off sharp emails accusing the board of bias. She started a petition calling for a review of towing procedures and broadcasting how she'd been ambushed. The board convened an emergency review meeting the next day. There were motions, secondings, defensive private conversations. I presented the chronology again. Notice posted, 48 hours allowed, no removal, laid out like evidence in a ledger. The property manager, Omar, sat quiet but steady, his demeanor that of someone who had been forced to act and now had to defend the act. He explained the steps he took, the chain of custody on the tow authorization, even the photos the tow crew had taken. Karen, predictably theatrical, accused us of a political maneuver, claiming I'd leveraged my private vendetta to weaponize rules. She produced a stack of complaints she'd filed against other residents and framed this as selective enforcement. Her voice rose and fell, like a practiced actress delivering lines she'd given herself to rehearse. Neighbors watched the exchange like a slow-motion boxing match. Alliances hardened. Phone calls were made in whispers. A few of Karen's closest allies, longtime residents who benefited from her vigilance, could not be moved on principle. They argued that any erosion of her authority would fall into anarchy. I watched their faces and thought of the many times she'd fined them for trivialities. I thought of the way she'd enforce standards that made life small and fearful rather than compassionate. After hours of debate, the board voted, narrow but decisive, to uphold the towing authorization. There would be no reversal. Karen could pursue civil action if she chose, but the board would stand by its process. That vote mattered. It was more than a bureaucratic checkmark. It was a public acknowledgement that the rules were not only hers to bend. For the first time in years, the HOA had applied its codes with a measure of even-handedness. People noticed. Still, I didn't sleep easily. The tow had been a lightning strike, but storms gather after lightning. I could feel the pressure building like a bruise under the skin of the neighborhood. Karen's next moves were unknowable but predictable in temperament. Smear campaigns, appeals to fear, a legal nuisance, perhaps even threats designed to make me recoil. She had resources, friends who owed favors, a practiced sense of how to be outraged convincingly, a willingness to go loud. In the dark of my kitchen, I arranged my next moves like chess pieces. I made copies of the tow authorization, the online complaint, and the photographs that documented the Merced's presence. I forwarded them to a small list: Omar, the property manager, Rick, the treasurer, and a neighbor, an up-and-coming local attorney, who had quietly offered to look over the documents pro bono. I wanted to make sure the record was plain and visible, so that if she tried to paint the episode into fiction, there would be a public ledger to contradict her story. Outside, somewhere beyond the streetlights, the Lexus's battered frame sat in the garage, a stubborn monument of a different kind of violence. It still hurt to look at the scars on its doors. The image of glass and rain and shattered pride lingered whenever I closed my eyes. But that night, the sting was tempered by something else, a sense that the rules were a tool and that tools could be turned. The hour of justice had not ended the war. It had only widened the battleground. When I finally went to bed, the house quiet and the neighborhood settling into its small civilized noises, I slept with plans layered like armor beneath my pillow. Karen would come back swinging. So would I. The difference now was that mine would be surgical and documented. I would not be baited into spectacle. I would keep records, witnesses, and process at my side. I would keep the neighborhood on the record. In the small hours, I dreamed of a street where people could leave their trash cans out without fear of fines, where rose bushes could bloom without being declared contraband, where a car could gleam in the morning light without it being a political statement. When dawn woke the cul-de-sac, for the first time in a long time, I felt we might get there. Not because I was stronger than Karen, but because I had learned how to make the rules work for people again. And that, more than any tow truck, was the real victory. The Mercedes was gone. The hour of justice had passed. The neighborhood watched. And now the rest of the story would be written in the small, unglamorous pages of procedure, patience, and public record. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains. Phones recorded. The same Karen who fined people for mailbox paint was now sprinting barefoot, chasing her own car down the street. Her reign of intimidation cracked under the spotlight. At the emergency HOA meeting, Karen demanded I pay for her impound fees. I calmly played the footage of her smashing my Lexus on the projector. Gasps filled the room. Silence swallowed her accusations. For the first time, the board turned against her. Police reports followed. Insurance lawsuits piled up. Karen's untouchable reputation gone. She wasn't feared anymore, just mocked. The HOA board voted to strip her of power, citing abuse of authority and criminal behavior. Weeks later, I parked a newer Lexus in the driveway. This time, no one dared to touch it. Karen's house. A foreclosure sign swung in the wind. As I polished the hood, I smiled to myself. In this neighborhood, karma doesn't knock, it toes.